The vibration of my phone in my pocket was so violent it felt like it was trying to punch through the fabric of my silk jacket, a rhythmic, frantic thrumming that cut through the smooth jazz and the expensive laughter filling the room. It was my daughter-in-law Megan's birthday party, an event she had orchestrated with the chilling precision of a high-end contractor, turning her sprawling coastal home into a showcase of hollow perfection. When David's name flashed on the screen, a cold knot of dread cinched tight in my stomach because my son knew better than anyone that I hated taking calls during these formal family displays. If he was calling now, while he was supposed to be at home nursing a migraine, something was catastrophically wrong. I ducked into a quiet corridor lined with maritime paintings and pressed the phone to my ear. "Eleanor, you have to get out of there right now," David whispered, his voice a jagged, hollow sound filled with a raw terror that made my knees feel like they were made of sand. "David, what are you talking about? What's going on?" I asked, the blood draining from my face as I stared at my own reflection in a hallway mirror. "Just go, Mom. There is no time to explain. Grab Leo and run. Don't look back and don't say a word to anyone. Just get to the car and go," he replied before the line went dead. I stood there for a heartbeat, my pulse thundering in my ears like surf against the cliffs. Then my survival instinct took over. I found my 4-year-old grandson, Leo, sitting by the dessert table with a plate of half-eaten cake. I grabbed his hand with a firmness that made him drop his fork, and without catching anyone's eye, I led him toward the heavy oak front door, with the crushing feeling that the entire foundation of my life was about to give way. Once I reached my SUV and buckled Leo into the back, my eyes fell on a thick manila envelope sitting right on the passenger seat, an envelope that hadn't been there when I parked. I tore it open with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking, and what I saw inside, between the surveillance photos and the clinical lab reports, left me pinned against the leather seat, unable to breathe. I was holding the architectural plans for my own family's demolition, a calculated scheme to bury me and my children alive under the weight of someone else's greed. Hello to all of you, my dear friends. My name is Eleanor, and I am speaking to you today from my home here in coastal Maine, where the Atlantic wind is biting and the wood of these old houses has seen more than its fair share of secrets. I am 78 years old now in 2026, my hair is the color of winter fog, and these hands of mine are weathered by decades spent at drafting tables and on wind-swept construction sites. I spent 42 years as an architect, and if that career taught me anything, it's that you can't build a life on shifting sand. Before I tell you the rest of this story, a story that cost me almost everything I built but gave me back my soul, I want to share the details of who I was and what I had created, because you need to understand the structure of my life to understand how someone tried to tear it down. At the time these events began, I was 56 years old. I was at the height of my professional career, a woman who had earned her place in a man's world by being sharper, faster, and more meticulous than anyone else. I didn't just design pretty coastal retreats from a climate-controlled office in Portland. I was the kind of architect who wore steel-toed boots, climbed scaffolding in the rain, and stood toe-to-toe with contractors until every bolt was tightened to my satisfaction. My late husband, Henry, used to joke that I had more rebar in my spine than any skyscraper in Boston. He had been my partner in every sense of the word, but a tragic car accident on a slick coastal road 9 years prior had taken him from me in an instant. It left me as a widow with 2 grown children, David, who was then 20, and Sarah, who was 17, and a legacy that I refused to let crumble. With the insurance settlement and the fruits of my own relentless work, I had diversified my assets. I owned 2 prime commercial buildings in downtown Portland that were always occupied by high-end law firms and medical practices. They brought in a steady, comfortable income of about $20,000 a month. It wasn't just money to me. It was my fortress. It was the guarantee that I would never be a burden to anyone and that my children would have a safety net. Then there was my home, a $1.2 million masterpiece of glass and cedar that I had designed myself when I was 45. It had 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch that faced the ocean, and a staircase that Henry had finished by hand. Every room was a memory. The kitchen tile I chose while pregnant with Sarah, the bay window where Henry drank his coffee every morning, watching the sunrise over the Atlantic, the sunroom that eventually became a playroom for Leo. I intended to live there until my last breath, on my own terms. David had married Megan 5 years before. From the very first day he brought her home, something about her felt structurally unsound. It wasn't just a mother's intuition or simple jealousy. It was the way she calculated her smiles, the way she evaluated every piece of furniture in my house, as if she were an appraiser for an estate sale. She was always too charming when she wanted something and entirely absent when she didn't. But David loved her, or thought he did, and when Leo was born a year after their wedding, that little boy with his wide eyes and easy laugh became the light of my life. He was my reason for getting up on the bad days, for keeping the garden beautiful, and for making sure the family remained whole. Sarah, my youngest, had married Robert 2 years before. On paper, Robert was everything a mother could want for her daughter. He was a high-level bank manager, well-dressed, articulate, and seemingly devoted to Sarah. But lately, I had seen the cracks forming in my daughter. Sarah had lost too much weight. Her vibrant personality had been replaced by a dull, sluggish silence, and she never visited me alone anymore. Robert was always there, hovering, finishing her sentences, and steering the conversation away whenever I asked her how she was really doing. I knew something was wrong. I felt it in my bones like a draft in a house with bad insulation, but I had no idea that the rot had already reached the beams. That night at the party, Megan was the picture of social success. She had turned her home into a stage for her own ego, and I felt like a stranger in my own family as I watched my children. David looked gaunt, his movements slow and clumsy, as if he were trying to walk through deep water. Sarah sat in a corner of the porch, her eyes vacant, barely responding to the guests who stopped to offer their superficial greetings. I thought perhaps they were just overworked or going through a rough patch in their marriages, but my architect's brain, trained to detect the slightest tilt in a structure, was screaming that this wasn't natural wear and tear. This was a deliberate attempt to weaken them. Robert and Megan, however, were thriving. They moved through the crowd with an aggressive kind of energy, whispering to each other in the kitchen and exchanging looks that were far too intimate for in-laws. Megan kept bringing me glasses of wine and herbal supplements, insisting that I needed to stay sharp at my age. She talked loudly about my little forgetful moments to anyone who would listen, acting the part of the concerned daughter-in-law while she planted seeds of doubt about my sanity in the minds of our friends. I would just smile and remind her that my memory could still recite every building code in the state of Maine, but the taste of her concern was like ash in my mouth. When David's call came and I fled with Leo, my heart was hammering so hard I thought it would crack a rib. Leo was asking me why we couldn't stay for the cake and why Daddy wasn't coming with us, and I had to lie to him, telling him there was an emergency at a job site. But the real emergency was the weight of that manila envelope on the seat beside me. I drove a few miles away, pulling into the gravel lot of a closed bait shop near the wharf, far from the party lights. The salt air was thick, and the sound of the waves felt like a countdown. I finally looked at the contents of the envelope, and my world didn't just crack. It imploded. The photographs were devastating. They were surveillance shots taken over months. Megan and Robert at a motel on the interstate. Megan and Robert entering a condo downtown with their arms around each other. My son-in-law and my daughter-in-law were having an affair, but it was much worse than simple infidelity. They were partners in a heist. Beneath the photos were medical records with David's and Sarah's names on them. I scanned the results, and a chill settled over me that no fireplace could ever warm. My children's blood work showed high levels of beta blockers and heavy sedatives, medications for conditions they didn't have. Megan and Robert were systematically drugging them, keeping them in a state of constant fatigue and mental fog so they wouldn't notice the money disappearing. At the bottom of the stack, I found a draft for a legal conservatorship. It was a petition to have me declared mentally incompetent due to rapidly progressing senility. It cited fake incidents of me getting lost, forgetting my own name, and being a danger to myself. Megan and Robert were listed as the proposed co-conservators. The plan was terrifyingly simple. Kill David by inducing a heart attack through over-medication, keep Sarah dopally compliant, and throw me into an assisted living facility while they liquidated my $2 million estate and vanished with the proceeds. They had even calculated the timeline, 6 months to total control. A cold, hard rage began to build in my chest, the kind of rage that comes when someone tries to set fire to a building you spent your life constructing. They thought I was just an old woman who was easy to gaslight, someone they could break with a few pills in my tea and some clever lies. They had no idea that an architect knows how to find the structural weakness in any enemy. They didn't know that David had already begun to suspect something and had hired a private investigator, a college friend named Thomas, who had delivered this envelope to my car. David had risked everything to warn me, and now I had to be the one to save us all. I looked at Leo, who was now drifting off to sleep in the back seat, completely unaware that his own mother was planning to leave him an orphan. I couldn't go to the police yet, not without a strategy that ensured David and Sarah weren't silenced first. Robert and Megan were dangerous, and they probably had a doctor on their payroll to sign those fake reports. I had to become the architect of their downfall. I had to move in the shadows, just like they had. I sat there in the dark, the bait shop sign creaking in the wind, and I made a vow. If they wanted a war, I would give them a masterpiece of destruction. I started the engine, my hands gripping the wheel with a new, ironclad resolve. I knew exactly where to go. I had an old friend in Portland, an attorney who had worked on all my commercial contracts for 15 years, a man who knew the law like I knew blueprints. I would drive there now, with the evidence, and we would begin to shore up our defenses. I would play the part they wanted, the confused, aging grandmother. But while they watched the facade, I would be digging a pit so deep they would never see the bottom. As I drove toward Portland, I replayed every conversation I'd had with Megan over the last month, every vitamin she gave me, every time she asked where the original deeds to the commercial properties were kept, every time she found my keys in a place I knew I hadn't left them. It was all so clear now. It was a siege. They were trying to starve out my sanity and my children's will. I wondered if they had started giving me things during our weekly dinners. I felt a surge of nausea, but I forced myself to focus. I had to be Eleanor the architect tonight, not Eleanor the victim. My children were depending on me to be the load-bearing wall for this family one last time. When I reached my friend's house, I carried a sleeping Leo inside, the house smelling of old books and safety. I laid the evidence out on his dining room table. My friend didn't say anything for a long time as he scanned the photos and the medical files. "Eleanor, this is attempted murder," he finally said, his voice grave. "If you confront them now, they'll hide the drugs and tell the judge your accusations are proof of your dementia. You can't just fight them, you have to trap them." I nodded. I knew he was right. Haste would be a structural error. I needed to let them think they were winning, to let their greed make them arrogant and sloppy. The next morning, I returned to my coastal home with a completely different mindset. I walked through the front door and saw the vase of flowers Megan had brought me a few days ago. I looked at it and saw a weapon. I sat in my kitchen, brewed a pot of tea using only my own supplies, and waited for the phone to ring. I knew Megan would call to check on me, to see why I had vanished from her party. When the phone finally rang, I took a deep breath, slumped my shoulders, and made my voice sound small and uncertain. "Eleanor, dear, are you okay?" "We were so worried when you left," Megan's voice came through the line, honeyed and lethal. I just don't know, Megan. My head was spinning so much. I think I'm just getting old, I replied, letting a fake tremor enter my voice. I saw her satisfied smirk in my mind's eye. The trap was set. For the next few days, I lived in a state of constant performance. Whenever Megan or Robert came over, I forgot where I put my glasses. I told the same story 3 times in an hour, and I left the stove on, unlit, of course, just so they could catch me. I watched them exchange those triumphant looks behind my back, convinced that their plan was working perfectly. Meanwhile, I was working with Thomas, the investigator, to gather audio and video from within their own homes. I had given David and Sarah hidden recording devices and detox supplements, telling them they had to be the best actors of their lives to survive. We were a secret army in our own living rooms, waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger on their destruction. My main focus was David. When he came over to my house under the guise of helping me with my taxes, we huddled in the basement where no one could hear us. "Mom, I can't look at her without wanting to scream," he told me, his hands shaking as the drugs finally began to clear from his system. "You have to, David. For Leo. For Sarah. We are building a case that will put them away for a long time, but we need them to feel completely safe," I told him. He looked at me, and for the first time in months, the light of my son was back in his eyes. He saw the architect in me, and he knew I wouldn't let this house fall. We were nearly ready. The blueprints for justice were complete, and the demolition was scheduled. All that was left was the final performance. The drive back to my cedar house on the cliffs was the longest 3 miles of my life. The coastal road, usually a source of peace with its rhythmic views of the Atlantic, felt like a narrow bridge over an abyss. Leo was fast asleep in the back, his small chest rising and falling with an innocence that made my heart ache. Every time I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, I felt a fresh wave of nausea. How could Megan, a woman who had carried this boy for 9 months, be part of a plan that included orphaning him? I pulled into my gravel driveway, the sound of the stones crunching under my tires sounding like bones snapping. I carried Leo inside, his head heavy on my shoulder, and tucked him into his favorite dinosaur sheets in the guest room. I kissed his forehead, whispering a silent promise that no matter what happened, his grandmother was still standing. I didn't go to bed. Instead, I walked into my home office, the room where I had designed some of the most iconic summer homes on the Maine coast. I sat in my high-backed leather chair and stared at the manila envelope Thomas had left in my car. My hands were steady now, a cold architectural clarity settling over me. I plugged the red pen drive I found inside into my computer. It was 11:47 p.m. The house was silent except for the distant moan of a foghorn and the frantic beating of my own heart. The first file I opened was a folder of surveillance photos. It was one thing to hear about a betrayal. It was another to see it in high resolution. There were shots of Megan and Robert entering a boutique hotel in Portland, their arms linked, their faces glowing with a secret intimacy. They looked like a happy couple on a getaway, not the spouses of my children. I saw them at a jewelry store, at a private dinner, and in a car parked at the wharf. The dates went back 6 months. Next, I opened the audio files. The first one was a recording from a microphone hidden in David's own living room. I heard Megan's voice, that sharp, high-pitched tone she got when she was excited. She was talking to Robert. "David is getting weaker every day," she said, her voice crackling through the speakers. "He almost fainted on the stairs yesterday. Is the dosage right?" Robert's voice came back, calm and clinical, the voice of a man who managed millions of dollars, but apparently had no soul. "It's perfect. The more dependent he is on the meds, the better for us. Sarah is already at that point too. I increased her anti-anxiety meds, and she doesn't even question where the money goes anymore." I had to cover my mouth to keep from screaming. They were drugging my son and my daughter, turning them into zombies in their own homes so they could move the pieces on the board undisturbed. Then came the folder labeled Eleanor. I felt a shiver of fear as I clicked it. It contained a PDF titled Project Liquidation. It was a spreadsheet, a professional, cold analysis of my life's work. They had listed my commercial buildings in Portland, the coastal land I owned, and this very house. They had estimated the total value at $1 million. Beneath the numbers was a timeline. Stage 1, weaken David and Sarah. Stage 2, isolate Sarah from family contact. Stage 3, gain Eleanor's trust or prove her mental incapacity. They had even consulted a doctor, a friend of Robert's named Dr. Valdir, who was willing to sign off on an early-onset dementia diagnosis for me. They were going to lock me away in a facility while David was taken care of by a heart attack induced by the wrong medication. They laughed on the recording. They actually laughed about how easy it was going to be to rob a confused old woman. I sat in the dark for a long time after the recordings finished, listening to the hum of the computer fan. I thought about Henry and how he used to say that a building only stands if the base is solid. My family's foundation was cracked, but I was still the architect. I knew exactly where to place the load to make their entire structure collapse. I pulled out my phone and sent a message to David. "Come here now, we need to talk, and thank you for protecting me, son." He replied within seconds. "On my way. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry for everything." When David arrived 30 minutes later, I almost didn't recognize him. My son, a man who used to be an athlete, who used to carry Leo on his shoulders for miles along the beach, looked like he was made of paper. He was gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes and a tremor in his hands that he couldn't hide. He fell into my arms and shook like a frightened child. "Mom, did you see it? Did you hear them?" he whispered, his voice failing. I led him into the living room and sat him down. "I saw everything, David. We're going to fix this, but you have to tell me how you found out." He explained that he had started feeling off months ago, dizzy, confused, his heart racing for no reason. Megan had insisted he see a cardiologist she knew who put him on heavy medication, but he only felt worse. He started suspecting something was wrong when he found a credit card bill for a motel on the interstate. When he confronted Megan, she lied, but he saw the guilt in her eyes. That was when he called Thomas, his old friend from college who now worked as a private investigator. Thomas had uncovered the affair, the altered medical records, and the plan to steal the inheritance. David had been gathering his own evidence, but he was getting weaker every day. He had sent Thomas to put that envelope in my car because he knew Megan was planning to use the party tonight to scout my house for documents. "She was going to use me, David. She was going to turn my own home into a trap," I said, my jaw tightening. David grabbed my hands, his grip weak but desperate. "I'm sorry I brought this cobra into our family, Mom. I was so blind." I looked my son in the eye, the man who was being poisoned by the woman he loved. "You weren't weak, David. You were decent. You trusted someone. That's not a flaw. It's a virtue. But now, we're going to use their own greed against them." I smiled, a cold, sharp smile that I usually reserved for contractors who tried to cut corners on my sites. I've spent over 30 years figuring out where to put the weight to keep a building up. I know exactly where to put it to bring one down. We spent the rest of the night planning the first phase of the counter-demolition. It was 3:01 a.m., but I felt more awake than I had in years. I told David he had to keep taking the vitamins, but replace them with placebos I would help him source. He had to keep acting weak and confused. And I was going to give Megan exactly what she wanted. I was going to become the frail, senile grandmother she thought I was. The next morning I called her. My voice was sweet, slightly shaky, and I made sure to sound a bit lost. "Megan, dear, I'm so sorry for running off like that last night. That dizziness came back. You know how it is at my age." I could practically hear her smiling through the phone. "Don't worry about it, Eleanor. We just want you to be safe. Maybe you should see that doctor I told you about." I told her I would consider it and invited her and Robert to dinner the following Saturday. The seed was planted. Over the next 3 days, I became a world-class actress. I called David while he was at work to ask if he'd had lunch, even though he had just left my house. I forgot where I put my keys and left the faucet dripping. I saw Megan and Robert exchanging those knowing looks when they came by to check on me. They thought the foundation was crumbling. They thought the old woman was finally fading away. Meanwhile, David was secretly detoxing, his mind clearing, and Thomas was gathering the final recordings we needed from Robert's office. But my heart was breaking for Sarah. She was still under Robert's control, appearing more like a ghost every time I saw her. She was thin, pale, her eyes vacant as if she were a broken doll. I called her, but Robert answered, his voice smooth and controlling. "Eleanor, Sarah is resting. She's had a rough week." I forced myself to stay calm. "Of course, Robert. Just tell her I love her." I hung up and looked at David. "We're bringing her back, David, no matter what it takes." The blueprints for the final confrontation were being drawn. We were identifying every pillar of their lie, every beam of their betrayal. The Saturday dinner was going to be the final inspection, and I was going to make sure the building didn't just crack. I was going to make sure it collapsed right on top of the people who tried to destroy us. The blueprints for our survival were drawn, but as any architect knows, the most dangerous part of a project isn't the design phase, it's the execution. I spent the next few days living a double life that would have exhausted a woman half my age. By day, I was the frail Eleanor, the woman who leaned too heavily on her cane and looked at Megan with wide, uncomprehending eyes. By night, I was the commander of a silent war room, coordinating with Thomas and monitoring the clearing of my son's mind. David was doing remarkably well. The high-potency detox supplements Thomas had provided were working quickly, and because he was no longer taking Megan's vitamins, the gray pallor of his skin was being replaced by a healthy, albeit angry, flush. We spoke in short, coded bursts via encrypted messages Thomas had set up for us. David was seeing the rot in his own house with terrifying clarity now. He told me how Robert would stop by their home and huddle with Megan in the kitchen, their whispers carrying the tone of business partners discussing a hostile takeover. But Sarah was the missing pillar in my structure. I couldn't rebuild the family while my daughter was still being held captive by Robert's chemical and psychological leash. Robert had ramped up his control, telling David and me that Sarah was too fragile for visitors. He was using her supposed depression as a wall to keep us out. I knew I had to be the one to breach that wall. I decided to use Sarah's love for family history and Robert's insatiable greed against them. I called Sarah's house on Thursday morning, making sure my voice was high and scattered. Robert answered on the second ring, his tone practiced and smooth. "Eleanor, how are you feeling today?" "Megan mentioned you had a bit of a tumble with your memory yesterday," he said, his voice sounding like a predator disguised as a caregiver. I let out a long, confused sigh. "Oh, Robert, I'm just a mess. But listen, I found Henry's old safe deposit key in a sewing kit. I think his mother's diamond brooch and the antique pocket watch are in there, but I'm too nervous to drive to the bank alone. Do you think Sarah could help me? I don't want to bother Megan. She's so busy with the charity gala." There was a long silence on the other end. I could practically hear Robert's brain calculating the value of a vintage diamond brooch. He didn't want Sarah out of his sight, but he wanted those diamonds even more. He probably figured a sedated Sarah was no threat even at a bank. "Fine, Eleanor. I'll bring Sarah by the bank at 2:00. "But don't keep her long. She really needs her rest," he finally said. I thanked him profusely, acting like a grateful child, and hung up. My heart was racing. This was the opening I needed. I called Thomas and told him to be ready at the bank. We needed to use those few minutes to give Sarah the same chance David had. At 2:00, Robert's black sedan pulled up to the Portland Bank. He walked Sarah inside, holding her arms so tightly it looked like a supportive gesture, but was actually a restraint. Sarah looked like a ghost. Her eyes were sunken, and she moved with a heavy, lethargic rhythm that made me want to scream Robert's crimes to the whole lobby. But I stayed in character. I hobbled over to them, acting flustered. "Oh, thank goodness you're here." "The manager is waiting for us in the private room," I chirped. Robert started to follow us toward the secure viewing area, but a man in a sharp suit, Thomas, looking every bit the bank security official, stepped in his path. "I'm sorry, sir, but only the account holder and one immediate family member are allowed in the vault area for jewelry inspections." "Bank policy," Thomas said with a stone-faced authority that Robert couldn't argue with. Robert scowled, glancing at his watch. "Fine. Sarah, I'll be right here. 10 minutes. Once we were inside the small, soundproof viewing room, I didn't waste a second. I didn't even look at the safety deposit box. I turned to Sarah and gripped her shoulders. "Sarah, look at me. It's Mom. I need you to listen with everything you have left inside you," I whispered. She looked at me, her gaze drifting. "Mom? I'm so tired," she mumbled. I pulled the lab reports from my purse, the ones Thomas had secured from David's independent tests. "Sarah, Robert is drugging you. He and Megan are having an affair, and they are trying to steal your inheritance and David's life. Look at these photos, Sarah. Look at your husband with Megan." I forced the surveillance photos into her hands. It was like watching a slow-motion demolition. Sarah stared at the photos of Robert and Megan at the Highway Motel. I saw the moment the chemical fog met the cold, hard steel of reality. Her breath hitched, a small, broken sound escaping her throat. No, Robert wouldn't. "He said I was sick," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "He's the one making you sick, Sarah, but you're not alone. David is with me." "We're going to stop them," I said, my voice like iron. Thomas stepped into the room and handed her a small kit. "Sarah, these are the same detox supplements David is taking. And this locket has a high-gain microphone inside. You have to go back to that house. You have to pour Robert's drinks down the drain, and you have to record him." "Can you do that for us?" Sarah looked at the photo of her husband kissing Megan one last time. Her tears didn't stop, but her posture changed. The architect's daughter was still in there. She took the kit and hid it in her bra. "I'll do it, Mom. I'll make him pay for what he's done to my head," she said, her voice regaining a sharp edge of clarity. We walked back out into the lobby exactly 9 minutes later. I was acting confused again, complaining about how I couldn't find the brooch in the box after all. Robert looked annoyed but relieved to have Sarah back under his control. He didn't notice the way she avoided his touch as they walked to the car. He didn't notice the fire that had been relit in her vacant eyes. As they drove away, Thomas stood next to me. "She's strong, Eleanor. Just like you," he said. I nodded, but I felt a heavy weight in my chest. I had sent my daughter back into the lion's den, and now I had to make sure the trap was ready to spring before they realized she was no longer their prey. The next stage of my plan required a different kind of architecture, the architecture of a rumor. I knew that Megan's ego was her greatest weakness. She loved feeling superior, and she loved feeling like she was the smartest person in any room. I needed to feed her a piece of information that would force her and Robert to move their timeline up. Arrogant people become sloppy when they think they're in a race. I called my neighbor, Irene, a woman whose hobby was knowing everyone's business and sharing it with the speed of a fiber optic cable. "Irene, dear, I'm so worried about my estate planning. I've decided to change my will. I think I'm going to leave 70% of everything to David and Megan because they've been so helpful with my condition. But I haven't told the lawyer yet. I'm keeping the draft in my office drawer," I told her, knowing full well she'd be on the phone with Megan within the hour. It worked perfectly. Thomas, who was monitoring the wiretaps in Megan's house, called me that evening. "Eleanor, they took the bait. Megan just told Robert they need to get into your office and find that draft. They're planning to come over tomorrow while you're out at your doctor's appointment, he said. I smiled. My office was ready. I had planted a fake will in the second drawer of my mahogany desk, a document that looked official, complete with a forged notary stamp. In this version, I was indeed leaving the lion's share to Megan and David, citing my increasingly clouded judgment as the reason for needing their protection. It was the ultimate ego stroke for Megan. I also left a small hidden camera inside a hollowed-out book on the shelf, aimed directly at the desk. The next afternoon, I made a show of leaving the house, telling Megan over the phone that I was heading into Portland for a checkup. Thomas and I sat in his van a block away, watching the live feed from my office on a tablet. 20 minutes after I left, Megan's car pulled into my driveway. We watched as she used her spare key to enter the house. She didn't hesitate. She went straight to my office, her movements confident and predatory. She found the key to the drawer in the violet vase exactly where I had hidden it. We watched her open the drawer, pull out the manila folder, and read the fake will. The camera caught her expression perfectly, a slow, hideous grin of pure triumph. She pulled out her phone and took pictures of every single page. She was laughing as she tucked the folder back and locked the drawer. She thought she had just seen the keys to her kingdom. She had no idea she had just photographed her own arrest warrant. That night, the audio recordings from the lighthouse statue in my living room were even more incriminating. Robert had come over to Megan's after David had fallen asleep early. I heard them clinking glasses. "We've got her, Robert. The will is exactly what we thought. She's practically handing us the keys. We just need to get the conservatorship filed before she has a moment of clarity and changes her mind again," Megan said. Robert's voice was cold. "I've got the doctor ready. We'll host the dinner Saturday night. We'll make sure she has a very public breakdown in front of the judge. Once he sees her talking to people who aren't there, he'll sign the emergency order on the spot." I closed my eyes, the sheer malice of their plan vibrating through the headphones. They were planning to humiliate me in my own home, in front of my oldest friends, just to speed up their theft. I spent Friday with my attorney and the local sheriff, a man who had known Henry and me for 30 years. I showed them everything. The surveillance photos, the lab report showing the sedatives in David's and Sarah's systems, the video of Megan breaking into my desk, and the recordings of their plans. The sheriff's face was a mask of grim fury. "Eleanor, we could pick them up now," he said. "No," I replied, my voice steady. "They've spent months trying to make me look like a fool. I want them to be the ones who look like fools. I want the judge to see exactly who they are in the very moment they think they've won. I want this demolition to be complete." The sheriff nodded. "Your house, your rules, Eleanor. We'll be ready." Saturday morning arrived with a thick, cold fog rolling in from the Atlantic, the kind of weather that makes the Maine coast feel haunted. I spent the day preparing the house for the dinner party. I polished the silver, set the table with my best linen, and curated a menu of David's and Sarah's favorite childhood dishes. It was a macabre feeling, preparing a feast for the people who were trying to destroy me, but it gave me a sense of control. I was the architect of this evening, and every detail was a load-bearing element of the trap. I even let Megan help me with the flowers that afternoon, acting especially vague and confused about the date. "Oh, Megan, is it already winter?" "The trees look so bare," I said, staring vacantly out the window. She just patted my hand, that hideous fake pity in her eyes. "Almost, Eleanor, almost." David and Sarah arrived an hour before the other guests. They looked perfect, subdued, quiet, and seemingly still under the influence of the drugs. But when Robert and Megan weren't looking, they each gave me a look of such fierce, protective love that I had to look away to keep from crying. We were a unit again. The guests began to arrive at 7. The family lawyer, a few old business partners, and Judge Miller, an old friend who had been tipped off by the sheriff but was playing his part to perfection. Robert was the boisterous host, pouring heavy drinks and telling stories about his successes at the bank, while Megan fluttered around me like a concerned nurse, whispering to the guests about how difficult the last few weeks had been. We sat down to dinner at 8. The room was beautiful, lit by candlelight that reflected off the glass and silver, but the atmosphere was thick with the scent of betrayal. I sat at the head of the table, slumped slightly, my eyes fixed on my plate. Robert kept steering the conversation toward my properties, subtly prompting me to say something nonsensical. I gave him exactly what he wanted. I started talking about building a house made of seafoam, laughing at my own joke, until the room went uncomfortably quiet. I saw Megan nudge the judge, a silent, "See what I mean?" The meal was coming to an end, and I could feel the tension reaching its breaking point. Megan stood up, her glass held high. She began a toast about family, about how we must protect those who can no longer protect themselves. She looked at me with a smile that was nothing but teeth. "To Eleanor," she said, her voice filled with a triumph she could no longer contain. I didn't drink. I didn't smile. I let the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable minute. Then I put my glass down with a sharp, echoing click. I stood up, my back straight as a steel beam, and looked Megan directly in the eye. The vacant look was gone. In its place was the sharp, commanding gaze of the woman who had built this family and this fortune. The demolition was about to begin, and I was the only one who knew that the building was already rigged to blow. The silence that followed my words was not just a lack of sound, it was a physical weight, a sudden drop in pressure that felt like the moment before a massive glass wall shatters under stress. Megan remained frozen, her hand still clutching her wine glass halfway to her lips, her face a pale mask of shock that didn't quite know how to react to the sudden shift in the room's architecture. Robert, who had been leaning back with the casual arrogance of a man who thought he already owned the deed to the house, suddenly jerked forward, his fork clattering onto his china plate with a sharp metallic ring that made the judge blink. I didn't look away from Megan. I watched her with the cold, focused gaze of a structural inspector who has just found the fatal flaw in a load-bearing beam. She tried to recover, straightening her back and letting out a high, forced laugh that sounded as hollow as a plywood door. "Eleanor, honey, you're clearly having one of your episodes again," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her attempt at a patronizing tone. "Maybe we should just get you to your room and the rest of us can finish our coffee in peace," she added, looking around the table for support. Robert nodded frantically, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed napkin. "Yes, Eleanor, let's not make a scene in front of our guests," Robert said, his voice rising in pitch as he reached for the wine bottle, his hand shaking so much that the glass rattled against the mahogany table. But I didn't move an inch. Instead, I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the lace tablecloth, feeling the solid wood beneath me. "There is no scene to be made, Robert, because the demolition has already begun, and you are both trapped under the weight of your own greed," I said, my voice resonating with a clarity and authority that I hadn't used in months. I reached into the folder I had kept hidden by my chair and pulled out the first set of documents, sliding them across the table toward the judge. "These are the bank statements from my Portland accounts," I explained, keeping my eyes fixed on Robert. "They show exactly how you've been siphoning off funds to pay for your gambling debts and that secret condo you thought I didn't know about." Megan lunged forward to grab the papers, but David, who had been sitting in a slumped, drugged-looking posture, suddenly moved with the speed of a professional athlete. He caught her arm in a grip that was as firm as a steel clamp. "Don't touch them, Megan," David said, his voice no longer a whisper, but a deep, resonant growl. "You don't have the right to touch anything in this house anymore." I saw the color drain from Robert's face, leaving him looking like a gray slab of uncurred concrete as he realized his financial facade had completely collapsed. But the money was only the surface damage. I looked over at Sarah, who was sitting across from Robert, her eyes finally clear and filled with a fierce, cold light. "Sarah, dear, tell them what Robert has been doing to you," I said softly. My daughter, whose voice had been a fragile whisper for months, stood up slowly. She looked Robert directly in the eye, and for the first time, he was the one who looked afraid. "Robert, I know you've been drugging me," Sarah said, her voice steady and echoing through the silent dining room. "I know about the pills you put in my water and the way you tried to convince me I was losing my mind just so you could steal my inheritance." Robert tried to interrupt, screaming that she was a liar and that he was only trying to help her through her breakdown, but I slammed my hand onto the table, a sound like a hammer hitting a nail. "Sit down and shut up, Robert," I commanded. "Every threat you made and every conversation you had with Megan about my conservatorship has been recorded." The room turned into a courtroom in an instant. Megan, realizing the game was over, dropped the act of the concerned daughter-in-law. She stood up and pointed a shaking finger at me, her face contorting into an ugly mask of hatred. "And what do you think you're going to achieve with this little show, Eleanor?" She spat. "You're an old woman with a documented history of confusion. We have the medical reports, we have the witnesses, and we'll have you locked in a facility before the sun comes up tomorrow." I just smiled at her, a smile that made her flinch. "Megan, the medical reports you had prepared are as fake as your marriage," I replied calmly. "The doctor you paid off has already been reported to the board and has provided a full statement about the bribes Robert gave him using my own money. Furthermore, the independent lab results from David's and Sarah's blood tests prove exactly what kind of toxins you've been feeding them." I watched the desperation settle into their eyes, that frantic look of a cornered animal realizing there is no escape route in the floor plan. Robert tried to stand up, perhaps thinking he could bolt for the front door, but David and the sheriff, who had been waiting in the kitchen with my attorney, stepped into the dining room. "Stay right there, Robert. We have a lot more to discuss, and I think the bank's internal auditors are going to be very interested in where that $500,000 went," the attorney said, his voice as sharp as a scalpel. Megan collapsed back into her chair, her head in her hands, her body shaking with a sobbing that wasn't born of regret, but of the realization that she had been defeated by the very woman she thought was a fool. I felt a wave of exhaustion hit me, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind you feel after finishing a dangerous high-rise project without a single accident. While the deputies began to formally process the evidence and read them their rights, I looked at my children. David and Sarah were holding hands across the table, united by a bond that Megan and Robert had tried to erode but had only ended up tempering like steel. David looked at me with a gratitude that made the months of acting and fear worth every second. I had acted like an architect who has to sacrifice a non-load-bearing wall to save the entire integrity of the skyscraper, and though the choice was painful, it was the only way to keep the roof from falling on their heads. Robert tried one last pathetic plea, turning to Sarah with tears streaming down his face, claiming he did it all for their future, but Sarah just looked at him with a dignity that made me proud to be her mother. "Love doesn't poison, Robert. Love doesn't threaten, and love certainly doesn't try to destroy a family for a bank balance," she said, her voice final and cold. Megan, however, kept her venom until the very end. She looked at the stairs, where Leo was hopefully still sleeping, and she hissed that I would regret this. But David stood between her and the hallway, shielding the path to his son from the woman who no longer deserved the name of mother. "Leo will never have to see this side of you again, Megan, because from now on, I will be the one deciding who gets to be in his life," David said, his voice ironclad. It was the moment of the final disconnect, the removal of the rotted pillar that had almost brought down my grandson's future before it even began. The attorney gave me a small nod, indicating that everything was procedurally sound. "Eleanor, we have them. These proofs are airtight, and they won't last 5 minutes in a real court," he assured me, as the deputies led Megan and Robert out of the house. The house, which had been filled with the stench of their arrogance and lies, suddenly felt aired out, as if a gale-force wind from the Atlantic had swept through and cleaned out every corner. I sat back in my chair at the head of the table and took a long, deep breath of the salt-tinged air. As I heard the patrol cars pulling away down the gravel driveway, I reached out and took David's and Sarah's hands in mine. The reconstruction will be long, and there are scars that will need time to heal. But today, we laid the foundation for a new, honest, and solid life, I told them, my voice trembling only with relief. We had won a battle that looked impossible from the outside, and we had won it not with violence, but with the intelligence and integrity of people who believe in the truth. Eleanor the architect had finished her demolition project, and now she could finally start thinking about how to make her family shine again. That night, after Leo had been checked on and my children had retreated to their rooms for a much-needed, drug-free rest, I stayed in the dining room for a while. I looked at the blueprints and documents scattered over the table and thought about how fragile human trust really is. A single miscalculation, a bit too much greed, and everything can come down in a heartbeat. But I also thought about how resilient the structure of a mother's love is, capable of withstanding emotional earthquakes and betrayals that seem insurmountable. I felt emptied out but whole, ready to face whatever challenges the rebuilding process would bring in the coming months, knowing that nothing is ever truly lost if you have the courage to face reality head-on. Justice was moving forward, and I knew I wouldn't falter. In the days to follow, there would be depositions, testimonies, and hearings. But I wasn't afraid. I had acted out of love and for the sake of the truth, and that gave me a stability that no legal attack could ever shake. I thought about Megan and Robert in their cells, wondering if they would ever understand the depth of the harm they tried to do, or if they would just keep seeing themselves as victims of bad luck. To me, they were just examples of poor architecture of the soul, structures built on selfishness that were destined to turn to dust when faced with the solid reality of genuine love. Sarah was the first to start taking her life back into her own hands. She began seeing a specialist to clear her system of the drugs Robert had forced on her and to work through the trauma of his manipulation. I watched her struggle every day, but I also watched her strength reemerge like a flower pushing through asphalt, and it gave me a joy I can't describe. David, despite the pain of Megan's betrayal, dedicated himself entirely to Leo, protecting him from the fallout of the arrest and the divorce. We were an open construction site, it was true, but it was a site where every worker was honest and every brick laid was a step toward a new, better stability. David came to me one afternoon while I was tending to the garden by the porch. "Mom, how did you do it? How did you stay so strong and act so well for all those weeks?" he asked, with a curiosity that touched me. "David, I did what any good architect would do when faced with a building on the verge of collapse. I studied the structure, I found the weaknesses, and I acted to make sure the fall didn't crush the people I love," I told him, smiling as I reached up to pat his cheek. His admiration was the greatest prize for all the silent suffering I had endured, the confirmation that I had made the right choice for all of us. In those months of rebuilding, I discovered things about myself I never knew. I didn't know I had such a reservoir of cold determination, or that I could be so ruthless against those who meant my family harm. But I learned that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, and that the wisdom of age is a powerful tool when used with precision. My life, which Megan and Robert had tried to strip of its dignity, was mine again, and I intended to honor it every day with the same passion I had put into my building projects for 42 years. The investigation continued and brought to light even more details of their crimes, including Robert's gambling debts, which were even higher than we had initially calculated. He had literally drained Sarah's business accounts, leaving her on the edge of financial ruin, but with my help and the savings I had managed to protect, we were able to shore up the business and get it back on its feet. It was like repairing a burst pipe that had flooded every room. But with patience and expertise, we dried everything out and made the structure safe and habitable again. Megan tried to write me letters from jail, filled with hate and accusations that I was the one who destroyed her life. I never opened a single one of them. I threw them straight into the fireplace, letting her words turn to ash, just like her plans for conquest. I had no room for her poison in my future, and I wouldn't waste a single moment of my clarity responding to someone who tried to steal it from me. Her defeat was total, and I didn't need any more confirmation of my moral victory over her mediocrity. Robert chose the path of silence, perhaps crushed by the weight of the evidence and the realization that he would never work in finance again. I knew he was facing a very heavy sentence, but it gave me no pleasure, only a deep sense of relief that he could never hurt my daughter again. Justice isn't a joyful revenge. It's a necessary balancing of the scales so that order can be restored and honest people can walk with their heads high without fear. One day, while walking through downtown Portland with Leo, I happened to see the doctor who had signed those false reports about me. He crossed the street to avoid me, looking down with the air of a man who had lost every bit of self-respect. I didn't feel anger, only a profound pity for a man who had sold his professional integrity for a few dollars, betraying the trust of those who came to him for healing. He was a collapsed structure, a man who would never be able to hold his place in society with dignity again, and his shame was a prison much harder than the physical one Megan and Robert were in. As I walked back to the car with my grandson, I looked at the old buildings of the city and thought about how much effort it takes to keep them standing, to make sure they are safe for the people inside. A family is no different. It requires constant maintenance, attention to detail, and the ability to act quickly when you feel a crack in the foundation. I had been the architect of our survival, and I was proud of it because I had the strength to love and the clarity not to be fooled by the deceptive facades of those who wanted to bring us down. The project of our new life was well underway, and every day that passed saw the structure becoming more solid and beautiful. David and Sarah had started smiling again, and that was the clearest sign that my work had been done well. Their health was back to normal, and their resilience had only grown after surviving such a perfect storm. We had become a different kind of family, perhaps less naive, but certainly more aware of our own power. Eleanor the architect could finally look toward the future with the certainty that the foundations of her existence had been tested and had held firm, providing a safe haven for all of us for the years to come. Every evening before I went to sleep, I made a small list of the joys of the day. Leo's laughter, a kind word from Sarah, a hug from David. These were the true riches that Megan and Robert could never understand. The things I had defended with everything I had. Life had put me to a brutal test, but I had come out on top because I never stopped believing in the value of dignity and truth. As I closed my eyes, I felt my internal construction was in perfect balance, ready to withstand whatever the future might hold. The silence that filled my dining room as the police led Megan and Robert away was heavy, but for the first time in months, it wasn't a silence born of fear or secrets. It was the kind of silence that follows a necessary demolition, where the dust of old lies finally begins to settle, revealing the bare, honest ground beneath. As the flashing blue and red lights faded from the windows, I stood at the head of my table, surrounded by the wreckage of our dinner and the papers that had saved our lives. David and Sarah were still sitting there, their hands trembling, but their eyes finally clear, looking at me with a mixture of shock and profound relief. I didn't know then that the months to follow would be a whirlwind of courtrooms, high-priced lawyers, and discoveries that would cut deeper than the betrayal itself, but I knew that the worst was over. Justice is a slow process, much like restoring a historic building that has been neglected for decades. You have to strip away every layer of rot before you can even think about the finish. In the weeks that followed that dinner, Megan and Robert had to face the reality of their choices in a courthouse in Portland. I was called to testify several times, bringing with me every single recording, every medical file, and every technical report I had gathered with so much patience. I still remember Megan's expression during that first hearing. there was no trace left of the elegant, arrogant woman who had paraded through my house. She was just a cornered woman, desperately trying to blame Robert for everything, claiming she had been manipulated and coerced. But the audio evidence I had secured was undeniable. Her own voice, laughing at my supposed dementia, echoed through the courtroom like a final sentence that left no room for mercy. Robert, for his part, collapsed under the weight of the financial investigation. The auditors found a massive hole in Sarah's business accounts, money that had been gambled away or hidden in secret investments that turned to dust. He was eventually sentenced to 4.5 years in federal prison with a strict order to repay every cent he had stolen, even though we knew most of it was gone forever. Megan received a 3-year sentence, which was later converted to home confinement with an electronic monitor, a restriction that prevented her from stepping foot near my property or David's house. She lost custody of Leo, which David obtained exclusively, and she was only allowed supervised visits that she accepted with more anger than maternal grief. Seeing those scavengers finally neutralized gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. It was the confirmation that Eleanor the architect had built a legal trap so perfect it had held firm against every attempt to break out. But the greatest victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was the rebirth of my children, a process I watched every day with the same attention a builder gives to a fragile structure as it grows stronger. David stopped taking those vitamins immediately, and under the care of a real doctor, he began a detox process that gave him back his energy and the mental sharpness Megan had tried to kill. I watched him smile again. I watched him start playing baseball in the yard with Leo on Saturday afternoons, and every home run was proof to me that the pillar of his life was solid again. Sarah, too, flourished once she was free from Robert's suffocating influence. She moved back into the villa for a while, took back the reins of her own business, and returned to being the strong, independent woman I had always known was hidden under that veil of sedatives. One moment I will never forget happened about 6 months after the trial, when David received the results of a DNA test he had decided to take. Megan had whispered something cruel to him during one of their last legal confrontations, a doubt that had taken root in his mind. We were in the kitchen, the same kitchen where so many lies had been told, and David held that envelope with his eyes fixed on nothing, terrified of what he might read. When he finally opened it and read that Leo was not biologically his son, the silence that fell over the room was heavy with an emotion I can't describe. He looked at me with tears in his eyes, and I simply asked him if that piece of paper changed anything in his heart. David shook his head firmly, tore the paper into pieces, and told me that Leo was his son by choice, by love, and for every second they had shared. No blood connection could ever equal the strength of the bond they had built. We started the paperwork for a legal adoption immediately after, making sure the law recognized what our hearts already knew. Leo was protected from the darkest details of the story. We told him his mother was sick and had to be away for a while to learn how to be a better person, a version of the truth that allowed him to grow up with the peace he needed. I continued to be his unbeatable grandmother, the one who took him to construction sites to show him how houses are built to stand against the Maine winter. I taught him that the most important thing isn't the height of a skyscraper, but the depth and honesty of its foundation. Our home became a place of joy again, a place where Sunday dinners were about truth, and where no one ever had to fear a poison hidden behind a smile. I had protected my legacy. Not just the buildings and the bank accounts, but the values of dignity and integrity that Megan and Robert had tried to destroy. Today, in 2026, I look back on those years with the awareness of someone who has survived a massive earthquake and knew how to rebuild everything better than before. Life has given me a few more wrinkles, but every line on my face is a scar from a battle won for love, a detail in the blueprint of a survival story that made my structure even more resistant. I talk often to the photo of my husband on my desk, telling him how our children have become whole again and how Leo is growing into a man who knows that character matters more than things. I tell him that our house is still standing, the pillars are holding firm, and I never stopped being the architect of our happiness, even in the darkest hours when it felt like the walls were closing in. I sold one of my smaller commercial properties to give David and Sarah a fresh start, not as an act of charity, but as an investment in their future and their freedom. Sarah now lives in a bright apartment she designed herself, a place filled with color and light, reflecting a soul that has finally returned to the sun. David is a present, attentive father, a man who took the pain of betrayal and turned it into a deep wisdom he uses to guide Leo through the world. We are a family that has known the darkest shadows, and because of that, we appreciate every ray of light with an immense, sincere gratitude. I don't feel hate for Megan and Robert. Hate is a useless weight that rots the beams of the soul, and I'd rather spend my energy on the people who actually deserve my love. They received what the law and life decided for them, and their greatest punishment was losing the right to sit at our table, to be part of a construction built on truth and affection. Their greed led them to lose everything that actually mattered, leaving them alone with their own bitterness. Justice did its work, and I watched it happen with the calm of someone who knows they acted for the good of their family. If I am here today telling you this story, it's because I want every woman who feels underestimated or afraid of losing control of her life to know that strength doesn't come from shouting. It comes from knowing how to observe and how to build your defenses with intelligence. Age is not a limit. It is an accumulation of technical skill that allows us to see the cracks before they become fatal. Never let anyone convince you that you are weak or confused just because you are kind. Kindness is a structural choice, not a design flaw, and dignity is a material that is never up for negotiation, at any price. Our life is the most important project we have, and we must be the only architects allowed to sign the drawings and decide on the changes. I defended my construction with everything I had, and today I can say with pride that my family's home is up to code, safe, and ready to stand for decades to come. My story is one of reconstruction, how from the rubble of betrayal, a more magnificent and honest structure can rise if you have the courage to never look away from the darkness. Stay clear-headed, stay firm on your foundations, and never forget that truth is the only cement capable of holding together the pieces of a life worth living. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me today and for allowing me to share these intimate fragments of my past. Telling these stories helps me keep the memory alive and reminds me that the strength of a woman is something extraordinary and inexhaustible. If my story touched you or gave you a bit of courage, I kindly ask you to leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel to hear more of my life stories. Please share this video with the people you care about, because a word of comfort or an example of overcoming can be the light someone needs right now to find their way out of the dark. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, and if you have ever had to rebuild your life after a sudden storm. Your words are a fundamental pillar for this channel and for me. Thank you again for your attention and for making me feel less alone as I remember these moments. I embrace you all with affection and wish for you to always be the sole architects of your own wonderful lives.